July 10th, 1918, 9 miles off the coast of Cape Clear, Ireland. Through the periscope of the USS L2, Captain Paul F. Foster watched something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A German U-boat, floating on the surface, listing heavily to one side, clearly disabled, dead in the water. But that wasn't what made Foster's blood run cold. It was the figure standing on the bow, a German officer, overcoat billowing in the ocean wind, arms folded across his chest, standing perfectly still, like a statue carved from shadow. Just standing there, watching, waiting. Foster was preparing to fire torpedoes when suddenly, an explosion ripped through the U-boat from stem to stern. A massive fireball erupted from within the steel hull. The sound was deafening. Even underwater, black smoke poured into the sky. The submarine broke apart in seconds. The bow plunged first, dragging the rest down into the cold Irish waters. No distress calls. No survivors scrambling to escape. Just silence. 37 men vanished with that ship in the blink of an eye. 37 souls swallowed by the sea. And the figure on the bow, he never moved. Never tried to save himself. Just stood there with folded arms as the ocean claimed him. But here's the thing that kept Foster awake at night. He knew somehow, he knew that man was already dead. The story of UB-65 doesn't begin with its sinking. It begins much earlier, in blood and screams, in whispers and dread, in the twisted metal of a shipyard where death came calling before the submarine ever touched water. This is the story of the most cursed vessel in naval history. A ship that German sailors feared more than enemy depth charges. A ship where death didn't just come from torpedoes and mines, it came from within. From something that couldn't be seen, couldn't be fought, couldn't be escaped. This is the story of UB-65, the haunted U-boat. It's 1916. The First World War has been raging for 2 years. And Germany is desperate. The British naval blockade is strangling the German Empire, cutting off food and supplies. Starvation stalks the streets of Berlin. Children are dying of hunger. The military is running out of ammunition. Germany has one weapon left. One terrible, desperate weapon that might break the British stranglehold and turn the tide of war. The U-boat. These submarines are the cutting edge of naval warfare. Sleek, steel predators that slip beneath the waves. Invisible to surface ships, they can strike without warning, sending thousands of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the Atlantic. By 1917, German U-boats had destroyed nearly 30% of the world's merchant fleet. But victory came at a horrific price. Life aboard a U-boat was a special kind of hell. Imagine being sealed inside a steel tube 200 feet long and 20 feet wide with 34 other men. You can't bathe. You can't shave. You can't even change your clothes for weeks, sometimes months at a time. The air inside reeks of diesel fuel, sweat, unwashed bodies, and the stench of the toilet bucket. The walls drip with condensation. Everything is damp and cold and suffocating. You're constantly on high alert, knowing that a single depth charge from a British destroyer could crush your submarine like a tin can, turning it into a steel coffin at the bottom of the ocean. No escape, no rescue. Just a slow death in the darkness as the air runs out and the water rises. The psychological toll was devastating. 3/4 of all U-boat crewmen never made it home. The odds of survival were worse than almost any other branch of the military. In this atmosphere of terror and desperation, something else began to grow. Something that fed on fear. Something that turned one particular submarine into a legend that would outlive the war itself. In June 1906, at the Vulcan shipyard in Hamburg, construction began on submarine UB-65. She was one of 24 type UB-3 coastal submarines, specially designed to operate from occupied Belgian ports. These vessels were built to hunt Allied shipping in the English Channel and the approaches to the British Isles. UB-65 would carry a crew of 34 men and 3 officers. She would be armed with a 5-centimeter deck gun and 5 torpedo tubes loaded with 10 deadly torpedoes. On paper, she was a formidable weapon of war. But from the very first day, from the moment her keel was laid, UB-65 was marked by death. And the dying had only just begun. To understand what happened aboard UB-65, you need to understand the world these men inhabited. A world of iron and blood. A world where the line between courage and madness grew thinner every day. The year is 1916, and the Great War has become a war of attrition. Millions are dying in the muddy trenches of France and Belgium. The battlefields have become slaughterhouses. But beneath the waves, another kind of warfare is unfolding silent, invisible, and just as deadly. Germany's surface fleet is bottled up in port, unable to challenge British naval supremacy. But underwater, the U-boats roam freely, hunting Allied shipping with devastating effect. In 1914, Germany had only 20 U-boats. By 1917, that number had grown to 140. These steel sharks were sinking merchant vessels faster than the Allies could replace them. In February 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, a desperate gamble to starve Britain into submission before America could fully enter the war. The strategy was brutally effective. In April 1917 alone, U-boats sank 430, Allied and neutral ships, totaling 852,000 tons. Britain was bleeding. Food supplies were running critically low. The island nation was on the verge of starvation. For a few terrible months, it seemed Germany might actually win, but the human cost was staggering. By the end of the war, U-boats had killed more than 30,000 Allied sailors and sunk over 3,000 ships. On the German side, 28,000 U-boat crewmen lost their lives, a casualty rate of 75%. 738 U-boats were destroyed. Think about that for a moment. 3 out of every 4 men who served on U-boats never came home. They died in explosions, drownings, or slow suffocation as their steel tombs sank into the abyss. Life aboard these submarines defied imagination. A U-boat was essentially a surface ship that could travel underwater for limited periods, but calling it a ship hardly captures the claustrophobic horror of the reality. The typical U-boat was 214 feet long and carried 35 men and 12 torpedoes. It could travel underwater for only 2 hours at a time before the batteries ran out, and it had to surface to recharge. Inside, the conditions were medieval. The crew lived in a space not much bigger than a city bus. Every inch was crammed with machinery. Torpedoes, ammunition, fuel, and supplies. There were no proper sleeping quarters. Men slept wherever they could find space, often on top of the torpedoes themselves. Patrols lasted anywhere from 3 weeks to 6 months. During that entire time, the crew couldn't properly bathe, shave, or change their clothes. They were constantly on high alert, knowing that at any moment a British destroyer might appear overhead and start dropping depth charges. The air inside was thick and foul. The stench of diesel fuel mixed with the smell of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and human waste. Everything was perpetually damp from condensation. Mold grew on the walls. The cold seeped into your bones and never left. But the physical hardships were nothing compared to the psychological torture. Long war patrols took a massive toll on the crew's mental state. Beyond the excitement of hunting the enemy or being hunted, there was little to do at such depths. The tedium was broken only by moments of sheer terror, and terror was the constant companion of every U-boat sailor. You lived knowing that the steel hull surrounding you was all that separated you from the crushing pressure of the ocean. One depth charge in the right place, one crack in the hull, and that hull would become your coffin. There would be no escape, no rescue, just darkness and cold water and death. Morale in U-boats depended on three crucial factors: success against the enemy, trust in the captain, and comradeship among the crew. If any one of these three factors failed, the crew could not be expected to perform efficiently. Fear would spread like a contagion. Discipline would break down. Men would crack under the pressure. Now imagine what happens when death comes, calling before you even leave port, when your ship is marked by tragedy before it ever touches water, when your comrades start dying in accidents that seem too frequent, too bizarre to be mere coincidence. That's when the whispers begin. That's when superstition takes root. That's when rational men start believing in things they once would have mocked. That's when a ship becomes cursed. UB-65 was a Type UB-3 submarine, part of the new generation of coastal U-boats designed specifically to operate from bases in occupied Belgium. These vessels were improvements over earlier designs, larger, more powerful, better armed. They were meant to prowl the English Channel and the western approaches, intercepting supply convoys heading for British ports. The specifications were impressive: a 10.5-centimeter deckgun, 5 torpedo tubes with 10 torpedoes, a maximum surface speed of 13 knots, and an operational range of up to 25,000 miles. On paper, UB-65 was a lethal weapon. She was built at the Vulcan-Werke shipyard in Hamburg, one of Germany's premier naval construction facilities. Her keel was laid in June 1916. She was launched on June 26th, 1917, and commissioned on August 18th, 1917, under the command of Captain Lieutenant Martin Schell. These are the cold facts. The official record, the kind of information you'd find in a naval registry. But the official record doesn't tell you about the screams. It doesn't tell you about the blood on the shipyard floor. It doesn't tell you about the workers who refused to board the submarine after what they witnessed. It doesn't tell you about the men who swore they saw things that couldn't possibly exist. The official record doesn't tell you that UB-65 was born in blood and would die the same way. The first death came without warning. It was a routine day at the Vulcan shipyard in Hamburg, June 1906. Workers were assembling the hull of UB-65, piece by massive piece. A steel girder weighing several tons was being lowered into position by crane. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual. 2 workers stood below, talking, taking a brief rest from the back-breaking labor. They didn't hear the chain slip. They didn't hear the warning shouts from above. The girder fell. One man died instantly, his body crushed beyond recognition. The other was pinned by the legs, his screams echoing across the shipyard as his co-workers desperately tried to lift the beam off him. It took them 20 minutes. By the time they freed him, he'd lost too much blood. He died later that day in the hospital. The foreman surveyed the carnage, the blood pooling on the concrete. the twisted remains and said what everyone in wartime Germany had learned to say: "It's unfortunate and tragic that 2 men had to die. But the work must continue. The fatherland needs ships." And so the work continued. The blood was washed away. The bodies were carried off. And UB-65 continued to take shape. But the workers noticed something after that day. A change in atmosphere. The usual banter and jokes stopped. Men worked in silence, hurrying through their tasks, eager to leave the submarine behind at the end of each shift. Some refused to work on UB-65 altogether, requesting transfers to other projects. When asked why, they couldn't explain it. Just a feeling, a sense that something was wrong with this particular boat. Weeks passed. The submarine neared completion. Then came the second tragedy. 3 workers entered the engine room to make final adjustments. It was a routine inspection, checking seals, testing connections, making sure everything was ready for sea trials. The door closed behind them. Minutes later, someone passing by heard coughing, then shouting, then desperate pounding on the door from the inside. The door was jammed. By the time workers managed to force it open, all 3 men were dead, sprawled on the floor of the engine room. Their skin had turned a sickly blue-gray. Their eyes bulged. Their mouths hung open in silent screams. Poisonous gas. Somehow, toxic fumes from the diesel engine had leaked into the sealed compartment. The official investigation found no explanation. The engine had been turned off. There should have been no fumes. The safety mechanisms had all been functioning properly. It made no sense. But 3 more men were dead. The whispers started then, quiet at first. Was this ship cursed? 5 men dead before it had even touched water. 5 families destroyed. 5 funerals held in Hamburg's rain-soaked cemeteries. But Germany needed U-boats. The war demanded it. So once again, the work continued. The day of the launch finally arrived. A clear day in the summer of 1917. Flags flew. Officers stood in dress uniforms. UB-65 sat on the slipway, ready to slide into the water for the first time. There should have been cheers, celebration, pride. Instead, there was nervous silence. Too many workers remembered the deaths. Too many had heard the stories. The submarine slid down the ramp and into the harbor. For a moment, everything seemed fine. The launch was smooth. The submarine floated properly, settling into the water exactly as designed. Then the weather changed. Dark clouds rolled in from nowhere. The wind picked up. Waves began crashing against the newly launched vessel. And that's when the 6th man died. A sailor, one of the original crew assigned to UB-65, was on deck, checking the hatches. A wave, larger than the others, swept across the submarine. When the water receded, the sailor was gone, vanished into the harbor. They searched for hours. His body was never found. The crew stood on deck, dripping wet, staring at the spot where their comrade had disappeared. A young man, barely 19 years old, looked at the captain and said what everyone was thinking. "Sir, this boat is cursed." The captain ordered him to be silent. "Superstitious nonsense," he said. "Accidents happen. The sea is dangerous." The man had simply been careless. But in his eyes, you could see the doubt, the fear. The sea trials began. This was when UB-65 would prove herself or fail. The crew took her out into the North Sea to test her systems, surface speed, diving capabilities, torpedo tubes, Everything needed to work perfectly. On what should have been a routine dive, disaster struck again. The captain gave the order to submerge. The diving planes angled down. The ballast tanks flooded. UB-65 began to descend. Level off at 20 meters. The captain ordered, but the submarine didn't level off. She kept diving. Deeper. Deeper. Blow the tanks. Blow the tanks. Nothing happened. A ballast tank had fractured. Water was pouring in faster than the pumps could handle. The submarine was sinking uncontrollably toward the bottom. It hit the seabed with a sickening crunch. Not deep, the trials were being conducted in relatively shallow water, but deep enough. Deep enough for the crew to know they were trapped. Water began seeping through the cracked hull, reaching the batteries. The chemical reaction produced toxic gas, the same gas that had killed the 3 workers in the engine room. The crew had maybe 12 hours of air. After that, they would suffocate. For 12 agonizing hours, they worked in near total darkness. Freezing water rose around their ankles. The air grew thinner and thinner. Men began to hallucinate. Some claimed they heard voices in the darkness. Others swore they saw shadows moving through the flooded compartments, shadows that looked like men but couldn't possibly be there. One sailor became hysterical, screaming that he could see the workers who had died, that they were walking through the submarine. Their skin blue, their eyes accusing. "They're here," he shrieked. "They're still here. They never left." The captain slapped him, ordered him to be restrained. But the damage was done. Terror spread through the crew like wildfire. On the 12th hour, just as the last of the oxygen was running out, they finally managed to get the ballast tanks functioning. The submarine lurched upward. They broke the surface. Hatches flying open. Crew members stumbling out onto the deck, gasping for fresh air. They had survived. Barely, but something had broken inside them. You could see it in their eyes. They had been to the edge of death and looked into the abyss. And some of them, the ones who had seen the shadows, heard the voices believe that something had looked back. The submarine was towed back to port for repairs. The crew was given shore leave to recover. But the damage went deeper than cracked hulls and flooded compartments. Trust, that essential ingredient for U-boat morale, had been shattered. The men no longer believed in the submarine. They no longer believed in their own survival. And then came August 1917, the day everything changed forever. UB-65 had been repaired and was ready for active service. The crew was loading supplies and ammunition for the submarine's first operational patrol. Torpedoes were being carefully wheeled aboard on trolleys and loaded into the forward torpedo room. Captain Lieutenant Schell's second in command, the executive officer, was supervising the operation on the forward deck. His name was Lieutenant Richter. The crew called him Der Schwarze, the Dark One, because of his olive complexion and black hair. Richter was 32 years old. Experienced, competent, well-liked by the crew. He stood on the deck, checking off items on his clipboard as each torpedo was secured. Nobody knows exactly what happened next. The official investigation never determined the cause, but at 3:47 p.m. on August 12th, 1917, one of the torpedoes exploded. The blast was catastrophic. The warhead detonated with the force of several hundred pounds of high explosive. Fire and shrapnel tore through the forward section of the submarine. The shockwave threw men into the water. The sound was heard miles away. When the smoke cleared, 5 men were dead. Lieutenant Richter had been standing directly next to the torpedo. The explosion had torn him apart. What remained of him was barely recognizable as human, just shredded uniform and blood scattered across the deck. 3 other sailors died instantly from the blast. A fourth died from his injuries later that night, his lungs destroyed by the overpressure. Several more crew members were seriously wounded. Burns, shrapnel wounds, traumatic injuries that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The submarine itself was heavily damaged. The forward hull plating was buckled. The torpedo room was destroyed. It would take weeks of repairs before UB-65 could sail again. But the physical damage wasn't the worst of it. Captain Lieutenant Shell stood on the dock, looking at the blood-stained deck, the twisted metal, the stretchers carrying away the dead and wounded. He knew with absolute certainty that he had lost something irreplaceable: comradeship. That vital third element of U-boat morale. It was gone. His crew would never trust this submarine again. They would never feel safe. They would go to sea, believing that UB-65 wanted them dead. And he was right. The repairs took 3 weeks. During that time, strange stories began to circulate among the crew. Stories that none of the officers wanted to hear, but couldn't ignore. 2 sailors were standing guard duty one night while UB-65 sat in dry dock. The docks were quiet. Most of the shipyard workers had gone home. Just the 2 guards, walking the perimeter, making their rounds. Around midnight, one of them saw something that made him stop cold. A figure was walking up the gangplank toward the submarine. A man in a German naval officer's overcoat, walking slowly, purposefully, as if he belonged there. "Hey," the guard shouted. "This area is restricted." The figure didn't respond, didn't even pause, just kept walking up the gangplank toward the forward deck. The second guard came running. "Who is that? Did you get a look at him?" They both watched as the figure reached the top of the gangplank and stepped onto the deck. He walked to the bow, to the exact spot where Lieutenant Richter had been standing when the torpedo exploded. Then he stopped, turned to face the harbor, folded his arms across his chest, and stood there, perfectly still. "Sir," the first guard called out, "you need to identify yourself." No response. The guards looked at each other. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. "Let's go," one of them said. They climbed the gangplank together, their hands on their sidearms. As they got closer, they could see the figure more clearly. An officer's overcoat, just as they'd thought, but old-fashioned, worn, water-stained, as if it had been soaked and dried many times. The man's face was pale, deathly pale. His eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking. "Sir," one of the guards said quietly, "are you all right?" The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there with folded arms, staring out at the dark water. One of the guards reached out to touch the figure's shoulder. His hand passed through empty air. The figure vanished. Both guards stumbled backward, their hearts hammering. They looked at each other, wild-eyed, each one hoping the other would tell him he'd imagined it. But they'd both seen it, both seen the same thing. A ghost, standing on the bow of UB-65, standing exactly where Lieutenant Richter had died. They ran to the duty officer and reported what they'd seen. The officer's first reaction was anger, drunk on duty. He assumed, or asleep and dreaming. But these were good men, reliable men. And they were stone cold, sober, and wide awake. More importantly, they could describe the ghost in perfect detail. His height, his build, his dark hair and olive complexion. The description matched Lieutenant Richter exactly. The duty officer tried to rationalize it. A shadow, a trick of the light, maybe one of the shipyard workers playing a prank. But he couldn't explain how both men had seen exactly the same thing. Couldn't explain why the figure had vanished when touched. Couldn't explain the water-stained uniform or the deathly pallor. And he definitely couldn't explain what happened next. Because over the following days, other crew members reported seeing the same figure, always in the same place, always standing on the bow with folded arms, always staring out to sea. Some saw him at dawn, others at dusk. A few claimed to have seen him in broad daylight. One sailor named Peterson swore he'd seen the ghost walk through a closed bulkhead door. Another claimed he'd watched the figure climb down into the forward torpedo room, the same room where Richter had been supervising when he died. The stories spread through the crew like a plague. Men who had never believed in ghosts were now afraid to board the submarine. Those who did board moved quickly through the forward sections, their eyes darting to the shadows, their nerves on edge. The day before, UB-65 was scheduled to depart on her first patrol. Peterson deserted. He simply vanished, disappeared into the streets of Hamburg, and was never seen again. The Navy launched an investigation. Of course, desertion in wartime was a capital offense. But they never found him. Some of the crew whispered that Peterson hadn't deserted at all, that the ghost had taken him, that Lieutenant Richter's spirit was claiming more victims. Captain Lieutenant Schell knew he had a crisis on his hands. His crew was terrified. Morale was shattered. Some of his men were on the verge of mutiny. But Germany needed U-boats. The war was going badly. Every submarine counted. On October 10th, 1917, Schell took UB-65 out of Bremerhaven on her first war patrol. The route took them through the Kiel Canal, then north through the Kattegat and Skagerrak to the waters around the Shetland Islands. It should have been a routine patrol, a chance for the crew to settle in, to prove to themselves that the submarine was just a machine, nothing more, nothing less. But the patrol was a failure. They spotted no targets, sank no ships. For weeks, they prowled the cold northern waters without firing a single torpedo. Worse, the crew remained on edge. The older hands, the men who had been with UB-65 from the beginning, were visibly nervous. They jumped at sounds. They avoided certain compartments. They spoke in whispers about things they'd seen but didn't want to report. Things in the shadows, footsteps in empty corridors, doors opening and closing by themselves, the smell of burned flesh in the torpedo room, and always, the feeling of being watched. The second patrol changed everything. In November 1917, UB-65 departed through the dangerous Dover Straits, heading for the Bristol and St. George's channels. This time, they found targets. A Swedish bark fell to their deck gun. Then the torpedoes found their marks. HMS Arbutus, a British sloop, sent to the bottom with all hands. 2 merchant steamers, 1 British and 1 Norwegian, followed. Success. Finally, blood in the water. Ships sinking beneath the waves. This was what U-boats were built for. The crew responded as expected. Their spirits lifted. Their confidence returned. Maybe, just maybe, the curse was broken. Maybe Lieutenant Richter's ghost had been nothing but collective imagination, born from fear and exhaustion. But the older hands, the men who had survived the accidents, who had been trapped on the ocean floor, who had seen Richter die, they knew better. They remained nervous, watchful, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It happened on the night of January 21st. 1918, UB-65 was running on the surface 15 miles south of Portland Bill. The weather was terrible heavy seas. Rain lashing the conning tower. Visibility near zero. They had surfaced to recharge the batteries. A dangerous but necessary procedure. On the surface, they were vulnerable to British patrol vessels and aircraft. The starboard lookout was scanning the darkness, his binoculars pressed to his face, water streaming down his oilskin coat. Through the spray and rain, he saw something that made his blood turn to ice. A figure, standing on the forward deck. At first, he thought a crew member had gone topside, though why anyone would be on the exposed deck in this weather was beyond comprehension. The waves were washing over the submarine with brutal force. One slip, one moment of lost balance, and a man would be swept overboard into the freezing water. "Hey!" he called out. "Get back inside. It's not safe out there." The figure didn't move. The lookout squinted through the rain. Trying to see more clearly, the figure stood near the conning tower, arms folded across his chest, completely motionless despite the waves crashing around him. Then the figure slowly turned to face the lookout. Even through the darkness and rain, the lookout could see his face. Bali, as death, eyes hollow and dark. Features he recognized. Lieutenant Richter. The lookout screamed and jumped backward, nearly falling from his post. His cry brought the watch officer running. "What is it? What's wrong?" "There, on the deck. It's him. It's Richter." The watch officer looked through the rain and spray. He too could see the figure standing on the forward deck, standing impossibly steady despite the pitching seas, standing where no living man could stand. "Captain, to the bridge!" the watch officer shouted into the voice tube. "Captain, to the bridge immediately." Captain Lieutenant Shell arrived within seconds, still pulling on his coat. "Report, sir. There's someone on the forward deck. The lookout says it's..." A massive wave crashed over the submarine at that moment, burying the entire forward section under tons of seawater. When it cleared, the deck was empty. The figure had vanished. Shell ordered a full muster. Every man aboard was accounted for. No one had been topside. No one was missing. But two men, the lookout and the watch officer, had seen the same thing. A figure in a German naval overcoat, dark-haired, pale-faced, standing with folded arms in impossible conditions. The dead watch officer, still aboard, still with them. From that night forward, the crew lived in terror. No one wanted to go topside after dark. When the submarine surfaced to recharge batteries, men had to be ordered onto the deck at gunpoint. They would complete their duties as quickly as possible, their eyes constantly darting to the bow, waiting for the ghost to appear. Several more crew members reported sightings. A petty officer claimed he'd seen Richter standing in the torpedo room at 3 a.m., examining the weapons as if conducting an inspection. When the petty officer called out, the figure had simply faded into the shadows. Another sailor swore he'd watched the ghost walk the length of the pressure hull, passing through closed, watertight doors as if they didn't exist. A machinist reported feeling a hand on his shoulder while working alone in the engine room. He'd spun around to find no one there, but the handprint remained visible on his oil-stained coveralls. The stories grew darker, more detailed, more disturbing. Men began reporting nightmares, vivid, horrifying dreams, where Lieutenant Richter came to them with a message. The boat wants more. The boat must feed. One sailor became so unhinged that he tried to jump overboard during a surface run. His shipmates restrained him, but he kept screaming, "He's coming for me! I can feel him! He wants to take me down with him!" That sailor was locked in his bunk, under constant watch, but his ravings infected the rest of the crew. The paranoia spread like a virus. Then, During a port call at Zeebrugge in March 1918, another death occurred. Oberleutnant Honig had just come aboard after meeting with Fleet Command. He was walking down the gangplank toward the dock when British aircraft appeared overhead, beginning a bombing raid on the harbor. Explosions erupted across the docks. Men scattered for cover. Shrapnel filled the air. A piece of shrapnel no larger than a playing card caught Honig in the neck as he reached the bottom of the gangplank. It severed his carotid artery. He dropped like a stone, blood fountaining from the wound. His headless body, for that's what it looked like, after the massive blood loss, was carried back aboard UB-65. That night, 9 men reported seeing Lieutenant Richter's ghost standing beside the canvas shroud covering Honig's corpse. The ghost had been staring down at the dead officer, his expression unreadable. One witness said the ghost had turned to look directly at him and smiled. That was the breaking point. The entire crew, to a man, requested immediate transfer off UB-65. They didn't care about the consequences. They didn't care about courts-martial or firing squads. They simply refused to sail on the haunted submarine any longer. The German Naval Command found itself in an impossible situation. They couldn't officially acknowledge that a U-boat was haunted, but they also couldn't ignore the unanimous testimony of 34 terrified men. The compromise was simple. UB-65 was placed into reserve at Bruges. The entire crew was reassigned. A new captain was brought in to investigate, and when that captain interviewed the crew members, heard their stories, examined the evidence, he became convinced they were telling the truth. Something was aboard UB-65. Something that wasn't showing up in any official reports. Something that couldn't be fought with torpedoes or depth charges. In a remarkable and unprecedented move, the German Navy called in a Lutheran pastor. Pastor Franz Weber was brought aboard to perform an exorcism. For 3 hours, Pastor Weber walked the length of the submarine, praying in every compartment, sprinkling holy water, calling upon God to cleanse the vessel of evil spirits. He stood on the bow, the spot where Richter had died, where his ghost had been seen so many times, and commanded the spirit to depart. The crew watched from the dock, hopeful but skeptical. They wanted to believe. They desperately wanted to believe that the curse could be lifted. But deep down, they knew better. Whatever haunted UB-65 wasn't going to be banished by prayers and holy water. The submarine sat in reserve for 2 months. And for 2 months, the stories continued. Dock workers reported seeing lights inside the submarine at night when no one was aboard. Sentries heard sounds coming from inside footsteps. Voix. The clang of metal on metal. One guard swore he'd seen a figure in the conning tower, clearly visible through the hatch glass. Though the submarine was sealed and locked, by June 1918, Germany was losing the war. U-boat losses were mounting. The Allies had developed better tactics, better technology. The tide had turned decisively against Germany. Every submarine was needed, even the haunted ones. Orders came down from Fleet Command. UB-65 was to be made ready for patrol duty immediately. A new crew would be assembled, men who hadn't heard the stories, who didn't know the history. Fresh meat for the grinder. On June 20th, 1918, UB-65 departed Bruges on what would be her final patrol. Captain Lieutenant Martin Schelle remained in command. He was a brave man, a good officer, but even he must have known, deep in his gut, that this voyage would end badly. The new crew members noticed something wrong immediately. Veterans of other U-boats, they could sense the atmosphere aboard UB-65. The way sounds echoed strangely in certain compartments. The cold spots that appeared without explanation. The feeling impossible to articulate, but undeniable that they were not alone. Within days, the sightings began again. Men who had never heard of Lieutenant Richter reported seeing a figure in a naval officer's coat, always in the same locations, always with the same folded arms, always with that deathly pale face. The crew tried to rationalize it. Fatigue, stress, lack of sleep, the mind playing tricks in the confined darkness. But rationalization only works until you see it yourself, until you turn a corner and find yourself face to face with something that shouldn't exist, until you feel the temperature drop 20 degrees in an instant, until you hear the voice whispering in the darkness, more. The boat wants more. By the second week of July, the crew of UB-65 was in the same state as their predecessors, terrified, paranoid, barely functional. They were hunting Allied shipping off the coast of Ireland, but they were also being hunted by depth charges in destroyers. Yes, but also by something that traveled with them, something that lived in the shadows of their own submarine. July 10th, 1918. Morning, 9 miles off Cape Clear, Ireland. UB-65 was running on the surface. Something had gone wrong, damage from a depth charge attack. Perhaps, or mechanical failure. The submarine was listing heavily, clearly disabled. Through his periscope, Captain Paul F. Foster of the USS L2 watched the crippled German U-boat. He was maneuvering into attack position, preparing to fire torpedoes and finish her off. That's when he saw the figure on the bow. A German officer in an overcoat, standing impossibly steady on the tilting deck, arms folded across his chest, staring straight ahead as if he could see through the water. See the American submarine preparing to strike. Foster hesitated. Something about the figure bothered him. The man wasn't moving, wasn't calling for help, wasn't trying to abandon ship, just standing there. Foster was about to give the order to fire when UB-65 exploded. Not from a torpedo, not from an external attack. The explosion came from inside the submarine, a massive internal detonation that ripped the vessel apart from within. Fire and debris erupted from the hull. The shock wave created a visible ring on the water's surface. The submarine broke in half. The bow section where the figure had been standing plunged downward first, dragging the stern section with it. From explosion to complete sinking took less than 10 seconds. No survivors. No debris. No bodies. Just bubbles and disturbed water. And then, nothing. 37 men gone in an instant. Foster lowered his periscope slowly. His hands were shaking. In his report later, he would write, "Just before the explosion, I observed a single figure on the forward deck of the enemy vessel. The figure remained motionless and made no attempt to save himself as the submarine sank. I cannot explain what I witnessed." But in private, in conversations with other officers, Foster said something more. Something that would haunt him until his death decades later. That man on the bow. Foster said quietly, "I don't think he was trying to abandon ship. I think he'd been waiting for the submarine to die. And when it finally did, I think he went down with it willingly. Like he'd finally completed some terrible purpose." UB-65 came to rest on the ocean floor off Padstow, Cornwall. She would remain there, undiscovered, for 86 years. 37 bodies entombed in steel. 37 souls trapped in the darkness. And one ghost who had finally claimed his ship. So what really happened aboard UB-65? Was it truly haunted by the ghost of Lieutenant Richter? Or is there a rational explanation for everything these men witnessed? The truth is, we may never know for certain. But we can examine the evidence, both the supernatural claims and the scientific possibilities, and try to understand what drove dozens of men to believe they were sailing with the dead. Let's start with the rational explanations. Consider the conditions these men endured. Sealed inside a steel tube for weeks or months at a time. Breathing recycled air thick with diesel fumes. Carbon dioxide. And the stench of unwashed bodies. Sleeping in shifts. Always on edge. Always knowing that death could come at any second from a depth charge, a torpedo malfunction, or simply running out of air. This is a recipe for psychological breakdown. During World War I, doctors were just beginning to understand what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then, they called it shell shock, a term that barely scratched the surface of the psychological devastation caused by modern warfare. Symptoms included hallucinations, paranoia, severe anxiety, insomnia, and what we might call dissociative episodes, moments where reality becomes untethered, and the mind creates its own truths. Now imagine you're a U-boat sailor who has already experienced multiple near-death situations. You've been trapped on the ocean floor for 12 hours. Convinced you were going to suffocate. You've watched 5 of your comrades die in a horrific explosion. You've seen blood and body parts scattered across the deck. Your mind is already fractured. Your nerves are shredded. You're operating on the edge of sanity. Then someone, just one person, claims to see a ghost. Word spreads through the crew. Now everyone is looking for the ghost, expecting to see it. And when you expect to see something strongly enough, your traumatized brain will provide it. This is called mass hysteria, or collective delusion. It's well documented in psychological literature. When a group of people are under extreme stress and share a common belief system, they can experience shared hallucinations. They genuinely see things that aren't there, not because they're lying, but because their minds are creating a shared reality. The lack of oxygen aboard submarines would have made this worse. When the brain is deprived of adequate oxygen, which happened regularly on long dives, it begins to malfunction. Judgment becomes impaired. Visual and auditory hallucinations become common. People see shadows that aren't there. Hear voices and the machinery noise. Add in the effects of carbon dioxide poisoning, sleep deprivation, vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight, and chronic stress, and you have the perfect conditions for widespread psychological breakdown. But here's the problem with this theory. It doesn't explain Captain Foster. Foster was an American submarine commander. He had never heard the stories about UB-65. He had no preconception about ghosts or curses. He was simply observing an enemy vessel through his periscope, preparing to attack. Yet he too reported seeing a figure on the bow. A figure that matched the description of Lieutenant Richter dark overcoat. Arms folded, standing impossibly still on a listing. Damaged submarine. How do you explain that with mass hysteria? Foster wasn't part of the German crew. He wasn't infected by their collective delusion. Unless, of course, he saw exactly what he said he saw. A real crew member, still aboard, who for whatever reason didn't try to save himself when the submarine exploded. Another possibility, the accidents aboard UB-65 were real, but the ghost stories were fabricated or exaggerated after the fact. And there's evidence to support this. The primary source for much of the haunting story is a British journalist named Hector Charles Bywater. Bywater was a naval expert, a talented writer, and crucially, a part-time intelligence operative. During World War I, he worked for British intelligence, gathering information on German naval capabilities. Bywater wrote extensively about UB-65 after the war, including detailed accounts of the ghost sightings. But researchers have discovered that some of his sources appear to be fabricated, references he made to documents and witnesses that may never have existed. Why would Bywater invent or embellish the story? Consider the context. During World War I, psychological warfare was a crucial element of the conflict. Both sides spread rumors designed to damage enemy morale. Stories of haunted ships, cursed weapons, and supernatural vengeance would have been perfect propaganda designed to make German sailors afraid of their own submarines. It's possible that British intelligence deliberately spread the ghost stories, using Bywater as their conduit. The goal would be simple: make German U-boat crews question their vessels, fear their missions, and potentially refuse to sail. There's no direct evidence of this, but it's plausible. Intelligence agencies have used similar tactics throughout history. However, this theory also has problems. The accidents aboard UB-65 were real and documented. Workers and crew members really did die. The submarine really did suffer an unusual number of mishaps. And German naval records show that the crew did request transfers en masse, an unprecedented event that suggests something genuinely disturbing was happening aboard that vessel. Even if Bywater embellished the supernatural element, there was clearly something wrong with UB-65 that went beyond normal wartime dangers. Perhaps the simplest explanation: UB-65 was just a badly built submarine. The type UB-3 was a new design. These submarines were being mass-produced quickly to meet wartime demands. Quality control was often sacrificed for speed. Corners were cut. Inferior materials were used when better ones weren't available. It's entirely possible that UB-65 suffered from fundamental design flaws or manufacturing defects. The ballast tank failures, the toxic gas leaks, the torpedo explosion. These could all be explained by poor construction, inadequate safety measures, and the desperate corners cut during wartime production. The workers who died during construction, industrial accidents were common in the early 20th century, especially in rushed wartime factories. The sailors swept overboard during the launch. The sea is dangerous and unpredictable. The final explosion that destroyed the submarine? German torpedoes of that era were notoriously unstable. Self-detonation was a known risk. From this perspective, UB-65 was simply an unlucky ship. The ghost stories were just how traumatized men tried to make sense of random tragedy by imposing a supernatural narrative on events that were actually just mechanical failures and bad luck. But again, this doesn't explain the consistency of the sightings. If the crew was just experiencing random hallucinations, you'd expect them to see different things. Different ghosts. Different phenomena. Instead, dozens of men over many months reported seeing the exact same figure in the same locations, with the same appearance. That level of consistency is unusual for mass hysteria or individual hallucinations. But what if just for a moment we entertain the possibility that something genuinely paranormal was happening aboard UB-65? Consider the circumstances of Lieutenant Richter's death. He died suddenly, violently, in the midst of a routine task. One moment he was alive, supervising the loading of torpedoes. The next moment, he was torn apart by an explosion. According to various spiritual and paranormal traditions, this is exactly the kind of death that creates ghosts. A sudden, traumatic death. No time to prepare. No chance to say goodbye. Just instant. Violent transition from life to death. If ghosts exist, if human consciousness can somehow persist after death, then Richter would be a prime candidate for becoming one. Add to this the fact that UB-65 was, in a very real sense, built from blood. 17 men died before the submarine ever went to sea. Their fear, their pain, their final moments of terror, all of that happened in connection with this one vessel. Some paranormal researchers believe that locations or objects can absorb psychic energy, especially traumatic energy. If that's true, then UB-65 would have been saturated with death from the moment of its creation. The submarine itself could have become a kind of spiritual magnet, attracting or creating supernatural phenomena. And then there's the question of the final sighting. Captain Foster's observation of a figure on the bow just before the submarine exploded. Foster had no reason to lie. He had no knowledge of the ghost stories. He was simply reporting what he saw through his periscope, a man standing on the deck of a doomed submarine, making no attempt to save himself. If that was Lieutenant Richter's ghost, had it returned one final time to witness the destruction of the vessel it had haunted? Was it finally satisfied? Was this the ending it had been waiting for? Or, and this is the truly chilling possibility, was the ghost responsible for the explosion? Had Richter's spirit somehow caused the torpedo to detonate, deliberately destroying the submarine and ensuring that no one else would have to suffer aboard it? In 2004, marine archaeologists located the wreck of UB-65 off the coast of Padstow, Cornwall. The submarine was positively identified through serial numbers and design features. The wreck survey revealed that the aft hatches were open, suggesting at least some crew members had attempted to escape, but there was no clear indication of what caused the final explosion. The external damage could be consistent with depth charge attack, internal torpedo explosion, or structural failure. The submarine's secrets had died with it. 37 bodies remain entombed in that steel coffin on the ocean floor. In 2006, the wreck was granted protected status under British law. It is now an official war grave. Diving on it is prohibited. The dead have been given their peace, at least in the physical world. But the questions remain. The mystery endures. Was UB-65 truly haunted? Or were the ghost stories just the desperate attempts of traumatized men to explain the inexplicable? Did Lieutenant Richter's spirit really walk the decks of that submarine? Or were dozens of witnesses experiencing shared hallucinations brought on by stress, fear, and the hellish conditions of U-boat warfare? Did a ghost destroy UB-65 inches July 1918? Or did the submarine simply fall victim to the same mechanical failures that had plagued it from the beginning? We have the facts, the accidents, the deaths, the witness testimonies, the final explosion. But facts don't always reveal truth. Sometimes they just show us the limits of what we can know. What we do know, beyond any doubt, is this. 37 men died in terror aboard UB-65. Whether they were killed by mechanical failure, enemy action, or something that exists beyond our understanding, doesn't change the fundamental tragedy. They died far from home. They died in darkness and cold water. They died screaming. Or perhaps they died before they even knew what was happening. And their story, haunted or not, serves as a reminder of the true cost of war. Not just the lives lost, but the sanity shattered, the minds broken, the souls left wandering in the darkness. More than a century has passed since UB-65 sank to the bottom of the Irish Sea. The submarine lies there still, 200 feet below the surface, off the coast of Padstow, Cornwall. A steel tomb containing 37 souls who never came home. In 2006, the British government granted the wreck protected status as an official war grave. No one is permitted to dive on it. No one is allowed to disturb what remains. The dead, it seems, have finally been given their peace. But the story refuses to die. Over the decades, the tale of UB-65 has been told and retold. Each telling adds new details, new embellishments, new layers of mystery. The line between historical fact and legend has become so blurred that even experts disagree on what really happened. Here's what we know with absolute certainty. UB-65 existed. She was built at the Vulcan shipyard in Hamburg. She was commissioned in August 1917 under the command of Kapitän Lieutenant Martin Schell. During her brief career, she conducted 6 war patrols, sinking 6 merchant ships and 1 British warship. She was lost, with all hands on or around July 10th. 1918, off the coast of Ireland. Multiple workers and crew members died in connection with the submarine during construction, during trials, and during active service. The exact number varies depending on the source, but at least 17 deaths occurred before the final sinking. Captain Paul F. Foster of the USS L2 did report observing UB-65 on the morning of July 10th. 1918. He did report seeing what appeared to be a figure on the bow, and he did witness the submarine explode and sink, apparently from an internal detonation rather than an external attack. These are facts. Documented. Verified. Undeniable. Everything else, the ghost sightings, the supernatural occurrences, the curse exists in that shadowy realm between testimony and proof, between belief and skepticism. War doesn't just kill people. It kills something deeper, something essential. It kills the ability to distinguish between what's real and what's imagined. It kills the boundaries that normally keep us tethered to sanity. It kills the part of us that can sleep soundly, that can trust the world, that can look at darkness without seeing monsters. The men who served aboard UB-65 lived in a hell we can barely comprehend. They were entombed in steel, surrounded by explosives, breathing poisoned air, knowing that death could come at any moment in any number of horrifying ways. They watched their comrades die. They felt the submarine shudder under depth charge attacks. They experienced the terror of being trapped underwater with the oxygen running out. They lived, for months, in conditions that would break most people in days. Is it any wonder they saw ghosts? Whether Lieutenant Richter's spirit actually walked those steel corridors, or whether traumatized minds created him from fear and grief, does it really matter? To the men who saw him, who felt his presence, who heard his footsteps in the darkness, he was real. He was as real as the torpedoes, the depth charges, and the cold water waiting outside the hull. Their terror was genuine. Their suffering was genuine. And in the end, their deaths were genuine. There's something profoundly sad about the story of UB-65. Not just the deaths, though, those are tragedy enough, but the way the story has been told over the years. It's been sensationalized, turned into entertainment. The suffering of real men has been transformed into a spooky campfire tale, complete with ghostly apparitions and mysterious curses. We forget that behind every ghost sighting was a terrified young man, far from home, serving in the most dangerous military service of the war. We forget that the haunted submarine was really just a badly built vessel manned by traumatized sailors who had every reason to be afraid. We forget the 37 families who received telegrams informing them their sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers were lost at sea. We forget the mothers who mourned, the wives who became widows, the children who grew up without fathers. These weren't characters in a horror story. They were real people, and they deserve to be remembered as such. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Do you believe UB-65 was haunted? Maybe you do. Maybe you think Lieutenant Richter's ghost really did return to the submarine, trapped by the violence of his death, unable to rest until the vessel itself was destroyed. Maybe you believe that some deaths are so traumatic, so sudden, that the soul cannot immediately depart, that it lingers, confused and angry, in the place where life ended. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you see the story as a textbook case of mass hysteria, psychological trauma, and propaganda. Maybe you believe that what those men saw was nothing more than shadows and imagination, fueled by stress, fear, and the knowledge that they were sailing on a submarine that had killed so many of their comrades. Both explanations are valid. Both fit the facts, more or less. But here's what I think is the deeper truth. It doesn't matter whether the ghost was real. What matters is that dozens of men believed they were sharing their submarine with the dead. That belief was their reality. It shaped their actions, dominated their thoughts, and ultimately may have contributed to their deaths. Fear is real. Whether its object is real or not, trauma is real. Suffering is real. The men of UB-65 suffered. They feared. They died. And that is the true horror of this story, not some supernatural specter, but the very human reality of what war does to the human mind and spirit. Tonight, if you stood on the cliffs of Cornwall and looked out over the dark waters where UB-65 went down, what would you see? Just waves. Probably just the endless rolling of the sea. But if you listened really, listened beyond the crash of surf and the cry of seabirds, what might you hear? The wind. Certainly. But maybe something else. Something that sounds almost like voices.